Today, we're going to be meeting someone who has been a very familiar face around here. She was an AmeriCorps participant the first year that I moved here, and it's really thrilling to see her again. Hybrid in a haystack is what we're going to be hearing about, and Dr. Rebecca Mostow will tell you more about that. But Dr. Rebecca Mostow, and I keep saying that because it's very exciting, she's a coastal ecologist and educator with over a decade of experience teaching, developing, and running innovative and experiential science education programs. She holds a bachelor's of arts in biology from Oberlin College, which is a wonderful place. My mother is was an alum. She also has her Ph.D. now in integrative biology from Oregon State University. Throughout her career, Rebecca has integrated scientific research with a love of community outreach and teaching. She's taught students of all ages from preschool through retirement, or as we say, pre-K to gray, and worked in diverse organizations, including ours, Port Townsend Marine Science Center, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. Dr. Mostow has conducted ecological research and education all along the Pacific coast, from Southeast Alaska to Panama, studying topics ranging from seabird population dynamics to the biochemistry of kelp reproduction. And they are very sexy, by the way. Her dissertation research used ecological, genetic, and participatory science methods to investigate a novel hybrid beachgrass in the Pacific Northwest. Without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Rebecca Mostow tell the rest of her story. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. It's great to be back. It's nice to see all of your familiar and new faces out here. Yeah, thanks for coming out, and thanks to Diane and to the rest of the PTMSC team for making this happen. And I've looked at the rest of the speaker series. It looks like a great assortment you have going. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I did for my dissertation at Oregon State University, and I completed it last year. And the title of the talk is Hybrid in a Haystack: Discovery, Characterization, and Ecological Effects of Ammophila arenaria x Ammophila breviligulata. Before we get too deep into it, I just thought I'd introduce myself. So as Diane mentioned, my name is Rebecca. You might remember me from when I was doing a lot of this, spending a lot of time with my head in those cluster tanks. And you might recognize a familiar face in the background there. That's Zofia. That's Dr. Zofia Anchondo, who is in the audience with here today. Yeah, so I spent a lot of time here at the Marine Science Center, and it was actually while I was here at the aquarium that I was first introduced to the beach grass. The grasses that I'm going to talk to you about today was on the Fort Worden campus that I met these plants that I'll tell you all about. Then I left Port Townsend. I went to grad school. I spent 2016 to 2022 living in Corvallis, Oregon, where I was studying these plants. And then when I got done, I moved down to Monterey, where I just moved and started at the Western Flyer Foundation. So now I'm working for the Western Flyer Foundation, running their education and outreach program. So I am open to answering a few questions about the flyer at the end of the talk if there's a lot of enthusiasm about it. All right, I always like to start my talks by saying, you know, science is a team sport. I introduced myself, but there's a lot of people whose work went into this research who are not here today. I have been lucky to work with amazing undergrads, partners from tribes, partners from the federal government, state government. So I'm grateful to all of those people. Some important characters who you'll hear about throughout the talk are my dissertation advisor, Dr. Sally Hacker, who's right there. Anytime you hear me talking about, you know, the way that the grasses grow affect the shape of the dune, that's work that Sally did. And then another important character is Dr. Felipe Barreto, another professor at Oregon State University. So any of the stuff I say about genetics, genomics, genome size, anything like that, that's work that I did in collaboration with Felipe in his lab. So I introduced the scientists, I introduced the characters in this story, and now I just want to tell you a little bit about the themes we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start by talking about hybridization. Why does hybridization matter? What is it? Why do we care when hybridization is happening in systems? And then we'll talk about invasion and like the particular instance of hybridization happening in invasive organisms. And then I'll move on to telling you actually about this beautiful system that I got to work in, the Oregon and Washington sand dunes along the coast. And then finally, we'll get into the meat of my dissertation research. So I'll tell you about the discovery of a hybrid beach grass in Washington and Oregon and the ecological, genetic, and sort of ecosystem service scale implications of that discovery. And if you ever get lost in the talk or don't know where we are in space, what are we talking about? Just keep your eye on this bottom corner. I'll have these little icons to tell you what's coming up, what section we're in. Okay, so hybridization. Hybridization is sexual reproduction between individuals of two different species. And I'm showing just some common examples of wild hybridization up here. I think most of us, when we think about hybridization, we either think about like a Prius, right? We think about hybrid cars, or we think about sort of classic hybrids that are like mules. Now many people think of ligers, right? You might even think about a pluot or a tangelo, something that you find in a store. So these are all artificial hybrids. So hybrids, which are again, like individuals that are produced with sexual reproduction between two organisms of different species. Artificial hybridization happens all the time. People purposefully cross two different species together. It turns out that natural hybridization, so hybridization that happens not because of human intervention, but is just happening in the wild, it's actually pretty common. So 10% of animal species and 25% of plant species are known to hybridize. That's just what we know about in the world, right? So it's probably a little bit more than that even. So hybridization is fairly common, and it is exciting for evolutionary biologists because it represents a time when you get genetic material that evolved in different organisms coming together in a new individual. And so just weird stuff can happen. Unexpected jumps in adaptation in evolutionary biology can happen in hybrids. Usually, right, we think about evolution the way that Darwin taught us, of this slow step-by-step process, just tiny changes over immeasurably long periods of time. Hybridization is one of those moments when instead of that slow process, you can get these exciting rapid jumps. So that's why evolutionary biologists care about it. And invasion biologists also really care about it. So I'm going to use the term invasive organism in this talk, talking about a non-native species, an organism that evolved someplace else, that got introduced to a new environment, and now is spreading really rapidly and changing the environment in some way or another. There's controversy about that word invasion. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it later. But yeah, so invasive species, when we think about hybridization happening in invasive species, I think it's pretty clear, like intuitive, why that might matter to us. We're talking about rapid jumps in evolution happening in organisms that are already having big ecological effects, right? We should care about that and pay attention to it. And I'm actually showing up here some common examples of hybridization in invasive species that maybe are plants that you've seen around, right? Tumble mustard, ice plant, that's Spartina anglica, maybe. It's another sort of beach grass type plant. So these are plants that have big impacts on ecosystems, and were actually produced by hybridization. So today, I'm going to add another example of this phenomenon for you. This is our hybrid beach grass, which is a cross between two different species of beach grass. Before I tell you too much about the hybrid, I want to tell you about the system that I work in, right? These beaches, the dunes, the sand dunes of the Oregon and Washington coast, why we might care about those dunes. So this is the native state of the Pacific Northwest coastal sand dunes. It is this low, hummocky ecosystem, super dynamic, like constantly shifting sand with pretty low vegetation density, like not dense plants growing all together, but lots of different species of plants growing. So here I'm showing just a few examples of the many beautiful, diverse native plants that we have on our dune systems. So this is what the native state of the dunes looks like. But in the early 1900s, beach grasses were introduced in order to stabilize that shifting sand environment. So the beach grasses were introduced, they spread outside of the areas where they were originally introduced, and they led to these large scale regional changes to dune shape and dune biodiversity. So this is what the dunes now look like in much of Oregon and sort of the southern sandy Washington coastline, right? The dunes are tall and linear, they are densely vegetated, and they are very stable with a pretty low diversity of plants growing on them, pretty much just this beach grass. And as an aside, I always like to point out that Frank Herbert, a famous sci-fi author, was actually so inspired by this weird story of grasses being introduced into a sandy environment and changing the environment really dramatically, that he actually wrote an entire series of sci-fi novels about sort of scaling up that story. But he actually went out to the Oregon coast, hung out on the dunes for a day, and was so inspired that he wrote this series. And I had my 15 minutes of science fame when the Dune movie came out in the past few years. Okay, so here's what the dunes look like now. Okay, and just to give you a sense of the scale of that change, what we're talking about, on the one side, we have our gray, black and white photos of sort of pre or early beach grass introduction. Here's what the beaches look like. And what I want you to notice is that there's all of this white, open, shifting sand in these photos. And then after the beach grasses are introduced, there is all of this green, stable dune happening in these photos. But also, the beaches aren't just densely vegetated, they're also densely populated. So the introduction of the beach grasses made possible the development of the Oregon and Washington coastlines in the way that they look today. And for a little bit of a local addition to the story, these beach grasses haven't just affected dunes and beaches on the outer coast of Washington and Oregon, right? They were also introduced to Fort Worden State Park. So in the 70s, both species of beach grasses actually were planted on the spit close to the lighthouse in Fort Worden in order to stabilize the sandy spit and reduce erosion. And then those beach grasses migrated south along the beach and stabilized the sandy beach, but also outcompeted your native plants. So there have been different effects of beach grass introduction. They increase coastal protection and increase sand stability. They work almost as sort of a living seawall, right? They build these tall linear dunes that protect coastal communities from storm surge and sea level rise. But there are also negative consequences. So the beach grasses outcompete native plants and decrease plant species richness, and also decrease habitat for native animals. So the western snowy plover is one bird species that is now threatened and state endangered because of the beach grass planting. The western snowy plover just will not nest where the beach grass is making the dunes too dense. And this, I'm also showing our pink sand verbena, which is a beautiful native plant that is state endangered because of beach grass introduction. So there's these complex trade-offs, right? The beach grass introduction has done exactly what it was introduced to do. They've stabilized the sand. They've built these tall linear dunes that protect the houses built behind them. But there are these negative consequences to the biodiversity of our coastline. So far in this talk, I've been saying beach grasses, right? But there are actually two species of beach grasses that were introduced to the Pacific Northwest coast. And they are Ammophila arenaria, European beach grass, and Ammophila breviligulata, American beach grass. And these two different species of beach grasses have differential effects on dune morphology, so the shape of the dunes that they build, coastal protection, the value of those dunes for protecting houses built behind them, and biodiversity, how many plants and animals can grow in that ecosystem. So for the next part of the talk, we're just going to zoom in on those two different species of grasses and think about the differences between them. So Ammophila arenaria is European beach grass. It is not native here on the Pacific coast and native to Western Europe. And Ammophila breviligulata is American beach grass, and it is also not native here in the Pacific Northwest, but native to the US Northeast and Midwest. I just want to point out that this is a pretty confusing common name, American beach grass. American beach grass is not native here in Oregon and Washington. We do have a native grass. It is called American dune grass. So I am only going to use the Latin names of these plants in this talk because I think having an invasive plant called American beach grass and a native plant called American dune grass is too confusing. No one can remember which is which. So our native plant is Lamus mollis. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. This invasive plant is Ammophila breviligulata. And we can talk Latin names at the end if you want to get those solidified in your brain. So these two species of grasses, they look pretty similar to each other, but there are a few ways we can tell them apart. And the most important is the ligule. So the ligule is just this thin piece of tissue between the leaf blade and the stem. I always describe it as like the armpit hair of the grass. Like you can imagine the grass like standing like this, look in the armpit, and there's this little piece of tissue. Ammophila arenaria has a long, skinny ligule, and Ammophila breviligulata has a short, flat ligule. So this is how we tell them apart in the field. And these two species, although they look pretty similar, they have differential effects on the shape of the dunes that they build. So Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes tend to be taller and steeper than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. And that is because of a positive feedback loop between grass growth and sand deposition. So Ammophila arenaria grows more densely, and because of that, it accretes more sand and it builds taller dunes. Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes also tend to have a greater plant species richness than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. So these two species, they were both planted in the Pacific Northwest in Washington and Oregon, and they have also both been planted all over the world in different places in order to stabilize sand. So they are non-native kind of in many, many sandy ecosystems all over the world. However, as far as I can tell, this area in Northern Oregon and Southern Washington is the only place in the world where they co-occur at a pretty high density. Like there's a lot of both of them. And so we are going to zoom in on this range overlap between the two species. And it was in this area, in the range overlap where they both occur, that in 2012, Ruben Beal, who was a lab mate of mine, somebody else who worked with Dr. Sally Hacker, he was conducting this long-term monitoring survey, and he was walking along the beach, and he found this plant that just didn't fit the story that I told you just now, right? I've been telling you there's two species, they look different, we can tell them apart. And he found this plant that just didn't fit that. It had ligules that kind of looked like Ammophila arenaria. It had thick stems that kind of looked like Ammophila breviligulata. And he thought to himself, like, this is weird. Could this be a hybrid? And then he found a couple more patches of it along the coast. And that's when I joined the lab. And this question, is this beach grass a hybrid, became the sort of spark question for the start of my dissertation work. So I asked, is this beach grass a hybrid? And I investigated that question in a couple ways that I'm just going to go through quickly. The first thing I did is I looked at the morphology of the plant. So what does it look like? Collected tons of plants, hundreds of plants, and measured a suite of traits about those plants. How wide are the leaves? How tall are the plants? How long is that ligule that I just told you about, right? And here are the results from that part of the experiment, or that part of the survey. On the x-axis, I have the species, and I'm using these codes. AMAR is just Ammophila arenaria. HYBR is the hybrid, and AMBR is Ammophila breviligulata. So those will be the same for the rest of the talk. So on the x-axis is the species, on the y-axis is the character trait that I measured. So here we have ligule length. And what this plot tells me, right, is Ammophila arenaria has a long ligule, the hybrid has a medium length ligule, and Ammophila breviligulata has a short ligule. I measured a suite of traits. We also have leaf width up here, shoot height up here. And what we found is that there are some traits that this weird looking plant was intermediate between the parents. and some traits where it was exceptional. It was way bigger than either parent species. So I thought, okay, that matches with what we would expect for a hybrid. And so then I went and I measured the genome size of these plants. I did this using flow cytometry, and if you want to ask about it at the end, we can talk about it. But basically, I measured how much DNA is in each cell of the plants, and that tells us about how many chromosomes they have, which tells us about their ancestry. And we found that the hybrid has an intermediate genome size when compared to either parent species. So then I was thinking, okay, it really does seem like it could be a hybrid. That's like classic hybrid to have an intermediate genome size. So then I went and I did a little bit of genotyping. So I went in and I sequenced some of the DNA and compared that to one another, to the different species. And this plot is just a clustering analysis that's showing us each of these columns is an individual that I sequenced. And then the colors represent the group that that individual got sorted into based on its DNA. So the clustering algorithm is saying all of these individuals that are coded red, they belong in the Ammophila arenaria group. All of these individuals, they belong in the Ammophila breviligulata group. And all of these individuals, which happen to be our potential hybrid, they belong half in the Ammophila arenaria group and half in the Ammophila breviligulata group. So this plot, when I got this, I like ran to my advisor and was like, it's a hybrid, it really is. And that was how we knew, and was the sort of spark for the rest of the dissertation. So this work has been published, is published in Ecosphere. So the answer to this question, is this beachgrass a hybrid, is yes. And as you all know with science, right, when you answer a good scientific question, it just produces more questions, right? So this was my first question, is this a hybrid? And it produced a lot more questions. So my first set of questions was just about the discovery, right? Is this a hybrid? How does it differ? What's going on here? But then the next set of questions I've broken up into questions about the range. So how much of the hybrid is out there in the world? Questions about the genetics of this plant that really come down to one of the most common questions that I get asked about this is it fertile? Can the hybrid reproduce? So these questions about the genetics are really just about its fertility. And then finally, questions about the ecology of this plant. I told you that the parent species, they change the shape of the dune. They affect genome size. They affect the size of the dune and the storage of the sand there. And so questions about what is the effect of this hybrid beachgrass on that ecosystem. So we're going to go through these questions one at a time, and we're going to start with the range. How abundant is the hybrid and where is it? This is important, right? Because like maybe there's only a couple patches of it, right? Maybe there's only 4 patches of hybrid. That was all we knew about when I joined the lab. And so like then it's cool that we found a hybrid, but it doesn't matter, right? It's not a big deal. It's not affecting anything. That's not the case. There are, so far, we have found 202 hybrid patches in Washington and Oregon. And this is work that I did in collaboration with my lab mate, Risa Askeruth, who is there and who made this dune movie. What do you call this? Like a Photoshop, incredible, of all of us in the dune poster. So Risa is a master's student in Sally Hacker's lab, and she has taken over the sort of search for the hybrid piece. And basically, in my first year in the lab, I went out and I searched for the hybrid. And I found it by myself all the way from ocean shores down to Pacific City, Oregon. So this is the very tip of the Oregon coast here. And then there's another, I don't know how far it is. There's a far distance. It's down in this bit. And then there's Pacific City, Oregon. So there's this big gap where we haven't found the hybrid in between. But in my first year, I found a bunch of patches of the hybrid and then had this realization, like, I can't search the whole Oregon coast for this plant, right? It is literally a plant that looks almost identical to the other beach grasses on the dune. How am I going to know where it all is? And so Risa then went and she searched a lot. And then we decided to partner with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition to start a participatory science project to get people who are already out on the dunes looking for this hybrid and identifying it for us. And that's how we made it all the way up to 202 hybrid patches, is because we started this iNaturalist project. So raise your hand if you've used iNaturalist before. Oh, great. Okay. So iNaturalist is a website where you can upload observations of living things, anything you see in the wild. And so we just trained people who are going to be spending time on the beach how to identify the beach grasses and how to identify the hybrid beach grass. And then we got them to upload their observations onto this website. And so this is what the iNaturalist project page looks like. You can find it if you go to iNaturalist.com and then you put in the search beach grass hybrid, you will find this project website, and I'll have a link for it at the end of the talk. But this is what it looks like. And this is actually an old screenshot. We now have, I looked yesterday, over 1,200 observations of beach grasses made by over 700 users. And I've given in-person and Zoom trainings to hundreds of community members, and so has Risa, my lab mate. And we're able to train people about how to identify the plants. And on the project page, there's an ID guide so that you can learn by yourself how to do it. Yeah, it's been an incredibly fun project for me to be a part of. And really, anyone who wants to can go onto this website, download the ID guide, and learn how to identify the grasses. You all could do it. You have both. You have an invasive species of beach grass and a lovely population of our native dune grass here in Fort Worden. So it would be awesome if more people from Port Townsend wanted to get involved with this project. All right. And this project, this participatory science project, has continued since I left Sally Hacker's lab. So there's more trainings happening, more ways to keep getting involved. All right, so there are 200 patches of hybrid in Washington and Oregon, going all the way up to Ocean Shores, Washington, and all the way down to Pacific City, Oregon. So this is not just some kind of scientific curiosity or a novelty. This is a fairly abundant plant that we need to learn more about. So that takes us into the genetics. This is where I began to ask, is the hybrid able to sexually reproduce, either with other hybrids or with its parent species? So often, remember we were talking about what is the first hybrid that you think of? You think of a mule, right, or a liger. Those are sort of famously infertile, and many hybrids can't sexually reproduce. And so we are wondering, how is the hybrid able to sexually reproduce? And if so, that has implications for sort of its long-term survival and ability to spread. So to understand the genetics of the hybrid and its ability to sexually reproduce, what I did was investigated which hybrid classes were present in the hybrid population, those 202 plants that we found along the coast. And so I'm going to give you a brief primer on hybrid classes so that you can understand the next phase of the talk. So here we have our sort of pretend example. We have two species of plants. We have our blue parent species and our red parent species. And if those two plants sexually reproduce, then they produce a first generation or an F1 hybrid. So this is the offspring of two parents of different species. And that can happen when pollen from parent species 1 fertilizes the ovule, the egg of parent species 2. But it can also happen in the reverse direction, right? So the pollen of the red parent species could fertilize the ovule of the blue parent species. In plants, the directionality matters. So if you ever hear me saying anything like the direction of hybridization, that's what I mean. Which parent is the pollen donor and which parent is the egg donor? The next class of hybrids is a second generation hybrid. So a second generation hybrid happens when two individuals who are first generation hybrids sexually reproduce. And yeah, they can have lots of weirder traits start to happen once you get into the second generation hybrids. And the last hybrid class is a backcross. So if any of the hybrids sexually reproduce with one of the parent species, that's called a backcross. So you can imagine that we see a population of plants that look like this, and we ask which hybrid classes make up this population of plants. And just from looking at these plants, we can't know the answer to that from measuring what they look like, measuring their morphology. But if we were able to tell, it would tell us a lot about the fertility of those hybrids, right? If I looked at what classes are present in this populations and I only found first generation hybrids, then I would be able to say like, oh, the hybrids are probably infertile. Probably the only hybrids are being produced are when the two parent species sexually reproduce. So probably our hybrids are infertile. If I looked at this population and I found first generation hybrids and second generation hybrids, then I know that the hybrid can sexually reproduce with other hybrids. If I looked at this population and I found first generation hybrids, second generation hybrids, and back crosses, then I know the hybrid can sexually reproduce with other hybrids and with its parent species. And that part, that it can sexually reproduce with its parent species, is really important for sort of downstream effects of the hybrid. There's this possibility that the hybrid can repeatedly sexually reproduce with one parent species, and that can lead to gene flow between species, which is like in evolutionary biology, we don't, that's new for us. That's not something we're into, right? Gene flow between species. So this possibility that the hybrid is sexually reproductive with its parent species is a pretty important thing to wrap our heads around. Okay, so this was our example, and here's how I actually did it with our hybrids. I took 118 samples of the tissue from the hybrid plants. I sequenced them at OSU. Here are just some pictures of me in the field. And here's a little bit of the first bit of the results from this project. So the first plot, the top plot, is just showing you another type of clustering, which is a PCA. Basically, the only thing you need to take away from this is when I throw, and each point in this plot is an individual plant. And so all you need to see here is that when I take the genetic data and I put it into this type of clustering, what we find is that all of the Ammophila breviligulata individuals cluster together, all of the Ammophila arenaria individuals cluster together, and the hybrid is this distinct but in the middle piece. And then you've already seen a structure plot, a plot that looks like this, but this is, again, each column is an individual and the colors represent the population that the hybrid is getting sorted, that the individual plants are getting sorted into. And so once again, all of the parent species, Ammophila breviligulata, all get sorted into one group. Ammophila arenaria all get sorted into one group, but the hybrid gets sorted as partially belonging in the Ammophila arenaria group and partially belonging in the Ammophila breviligulata group. But there's one that looks a little bit weird here, right? There is one individual, hybrid individual, that has a lot of its ancestry from Ammophila arenaria, a lot more than 50%. So we're looking at this and wondering, could this be evidence of backcrossing, of sexual reproduction with one of the parents? So to really understand which hybrid classes are present in this population, we have to make a different kind of plot than either of those sort of like classic genetic data plots. And this is called a triangle plot. So a triangle plot on the x-axis has your hybrid index. And that is just the proportion of your genetic material that's from one parent species. So this is, I'm going to show us our example plants again. So what is the proportion of your genetics that are from parent species 2, the red parent species? If you're all the way over here in this corner, all of your genetic material is from parent species 2, you're just a red parent species 2. No hybridization has occurred. And then on the y-axis, we have heterozygosity. That's a measure of how mixed is your genome. So it's a measure of if you had a heterozygosity of 1, that means that for every single gene in your genotype, you have an allele, 1 from your red parent and 1 from the blue parent, right? Each chromosome you have in your body, 1 of them is from the red parent and 1 is from the blue parent. And there hasn't been any kind of mixing between them. So a first generation hybrid would fall right up here. It would have a hybrid index of 0.5. It is exactly halfway between parent species 1 and parent species 2, right? And it has an interspecific heterozygosity of 1. It has always 1 allele from each parent species. if we had second generation hybrids, so hybrids produced by reproduction between hybrids, they'll fall here in the middle of the plot. They'll have lower heterozygosity because recombination has happened, but they'll also have this hybrid index of 0.5 or close to it. But then if there's back crossing, if there's been sexual reproduction with a parent species, then they fall on the lines of the triangle plot. So this is why the triangle plot is useful for us, because we can look at where our individuals fall in the space of the triangle plot and figure out what is their, which hybrid class are they. Okay, so this was our example data. I feel like maybe we're ready for our real data. Okay, so on the x-axis, we have hybrid index. We're measuring the proportion of the genome from Ammophila arenaria, so that European beachgrass species. And each point is going to be an individual hybrid that we looked at. I have them coded by what region they were collected in, that's the color. And then the shape is which parent is the maternal parent, which parent gave the egg to this baby hybrid. So here's what our data set looks like. So the first thing to notice is that there are dots all over the triangle, right? So there are lots of different hybrid classes present in this population. These dots up here, these are first generation hybrids, individuals produced by sexual reproduction between two of the parent species. These dots here at the low part, these are second or later generation hybrids. So these are hybrids that are being produced when hybrids are making seeds. And this one here is a backcross between a hybrid and Ammophila arenaria, the European beachgrass. So we have a hybrid population made up of hybrids of all three classes, which tells us that our hybrids are able to sexually reproduce, and there's a possibility for gene flow between the two parent species. And all of the different kinds of hybrids are being produced in all of the different regions that I looked at. So it's not like there's just one hybrid that was produced that's able to sexually reproduce, and all of the other ones, they're just going to be F1s. These second generation hybrids are being produced up and down the coast in both directions of hybridization. I think I just said all this. So we can now call this a hybrid swarm. The hybrid is fertile. There are few barriers to hybridization and backcrossing. This is a population of interbreeding hybrids, and repeated backcrossing between the hybrids can lead to gene flow between species. I think future research should really look at what are the morphological differences between these different classes of hybrids, between the first generation, second generation, and backcrosses. Do they look different? Do they build different kinds of dunes? Are these different kinds of hybrids going to have different ecological effects? Okay, so that was our question number 2. Is the hybrid able to sexually reproduce? And the answer is yes, which is a wild, unexpected result for me. And the last set of questions that I have is about the ecological interactions of the hybrid, or the ecological impacts of the hybrid. So I asked, does the hybrid look different from its parent species? And if it looks different, is it going to build different shaped dunes? And does the hybrid compete with its parent species? Is it competing with the parents and going to sort of elbow them out of space on the dunes? To answer these questions, I installed this large-scale growth and species interaction experiment. This is an experiment that was funded by a Markham Research Award and was done at the Hatfield Marine Science Center down in Newport, Oregon. And it was also funded by a Sea Grant to Sally Hacker and Felipe Barreto. So the idea of this experiment is we planted grasses. Here are little grasses, right? We're planting them in these big plastic sandbags. This is 1 meter by 1 meter about. We planted our grasses in here, and we planted them in different densities. So lots of plants all squished in together, or just a few plants by themselves, and then in different combinations. So the hybrid versus each of its parent species, and the parent species versus each other. So it's like kind of like a grass face-off situation, but like slow motion. So here are our treatments. We have 9 treatments, 3 high density monocultures, so just high density, but only one kind of plant, 3 low density monocultures, and then 3 2-species interaction treatments. And then I had 6 replicates of that. So this is what the array looks like. There are 9 treatments, and then they're randomly organized into 6 replicate blocks. That's me. I'm very tired, but I'm moving sand around. Yeah, so we installed that experiment and let it grow for 18 months. And note that this experiment started in March 2020. So the installation did not go as planned. I was like Lysoling shovel handles, and it was like very early pandemic. We installed it the day before the governor's stay-at-home order. Yeah, and then partly because it was the pandemic and I was locked in my house, I returned 2 times a month to the experiment as a reason to leave my house. I had to return once a month because these are dune grasses, so they actually need sand deposition to grow. So every month I would go and dump 2 centimeters of sand, basically a half of a 5-gallon bucket of sand onto each of the bags, which is 54 bags and me. Anyway, and then I would also go out once a month and count the number of stems in each bag. So count the number of stems and see how tall they were. So I was monitoring throughout the experiment how many plants were in each bag. And they grew really well, as you can see. They grew in really densely. They are invasive, so I can't take a lot of credit for how well they grew. And then after 18 months, it was time to take the experiment apart and see who won those face-offs, right? So I cut off the plastic part of our bag, right? And this is what it looked like. These little biscuits of sand is what it looked like. And it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but it's almost root bound, just dense with roots. The below ground growth just blew my mind. And I did not fully plan on the amount of below ground growth that we had. I had this sort of vision in my mind that we would go to the experiment and we would pull up the plants and weigh them, sort of like harvesting carrots. And that was totally wrong. It was not like harvesting carrots. It was much more like trying to get gum out of your hair. It was a wild process. We ended up dusting the sand off of the bags and then spraying them down with hoses and then picking up these huge plants. This is me and Dakota. I'm soaking wet holding this large plant, and we would dunk them into these buckets of water to try to get the sand off. We spent 2 weeks removing these plants from the experiment, and 12 people volunteered to come out and help me dig trenches to get the water to flow away and dunk plants. So thank you to everyone who volunteered on that project. I extremely literally could not have done it without all of their help. So then I took these plants back to our lab in Corvallis and I dried them out in the lab. And then we measured a suite of traits of the plant. So I counted all of the stems, the total number of stems. I weighed the below ground biomass, the above ground biomass. I measured all of the rhizomes. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the data that we got from that experiment. So remember I told you I returned every month and counted the number of stems. So here on the x-axis, we have the date of the day that I went and I counted the stems. And on the y-axis, the stem density, just the number of stems per bag. And here I'm showing Ammophila breviligulata stem density over time. So this is the American beachgrass. How many stems were in these are the high density monoculture bags. And what you can see is that they start at this really low density. Most of the bags have really close to the same number of stems per bag. And then by the end, they have 125-ish stems per bag. There's more variation in how many stems are in each bag. Here, layered on top, is the growth of Ammophila arenaria over time. So once again, Ammophila arenaria starts with a low density, grows up to almost the same density as the Ammophila breviligulata bags, although they don't get there in the same way. These 2 different species are adding stems in different seasons. So Ammophila arenaria has this big pulse of growth in the spring, and then sort of a slow climb, and then again another growth pulse, whereas Ammophila breviligulata has its highest growth rate in the very, very late winter, early spring. Okay, now I'm going to layer the growth of our hybrid on top. Thanks. the most satisfying thing is hearing people respond to your science like that. Yes, yeah, I did that. I made that voice every time I went out to the experiment and gasped a little bit at how dense the hybrid was getting. So yeah, the hybrid ended up with almost twice the density of stems per bag as the parent species. And the other thing to notice is the hybrid bag almost looks like an additive model of these two, of the Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria growth curves. So anytime either species was adding stems, the hybrid was adding stems, which, like, how? Yeah, so amazing, mind blown. It grows extremely densely. Yeah, the hybrid grows at a much higher stem density than either parent species. So now I'm just going to zoom in on this last time point. The hybrid is super, super dense at this point, but what else do we know about it? It was also much heavier. So on the x-axis, we have the species, and on the y-axis, the total biomass. So just how heavy they are. And you can see Ammophila arenaria is the lightest total biomass, and then the hybrid is the highest. Ammophila breviligulata is intermediate. And I'm just showing you here bags that didn't have any competition in them. So just the hybrid or Ammophila area, just one species growing by itself. I'm going to layer onto here the biomass of plants grown in competition. So versus in one of those face-off treatments. Before I put it on, think in your head, if there is an effect of competition, will the biomass be higher, the same, or lower than if they're growing without competition? So think in your head, make your prediction. So the biomass of plants grown in competition is always lower than the biomass of plants not grown, just grown with other ones of their own species. And the effect of that competition is pretty strong. But just looking at this plot, just looking at, okay, what is the biomass of these plants? It's a little bit hard to tell the magnitude of that effect, right? I really want to know, is growing with the hybrid worse for Ammophila arenaria than growing with Ammophila breviligulata or growing with other Ammophila arenarias? So to do that, I calculated the magnitude of the strength of that interaction. How strong is the effect of those different plants on one another? And I did that using something called the log response ratio, but you can just think about it as I'm quantifying the impact of competition, the strength of competition. And this is competition because these are all negative. If they were positive, that would be facilitation. These are all negative. All of these bars have little stars by them because they're all significant effects of competition. And you can read this plot as the effect of the hybrid on Ammophila breviligulata, on Ammophila arenaria, right? The effect of Ammophila arenaria on Ammophila breviligulata. So the big thing to take away here is all of the effects that I measured, every species interaction I measured, there was negative effects. There was big competition happening. There's big magnitude of competition happening on biomass, and the effect of the hybrid on Ammophila breviligulata is really strong. There's a really strong negative effect of the hybrid on Ammophila breviligulata. I measured this in other traits. I'm going to just skip through this. There's a strong effect of competition, of competing with the hybrid on both species, but especially on Ammophila breviligulata. So far, I've just told you about the magnitude of the effect. And I said to you, okay, growing with the hybrid is bad for the total size of the parent species plants. But what does that mean sort of long term? Okay, so growing with a hybrid is bad for a plant, but like, is that going to change which plants are present on the dune? Is the hybrid going to outcompete the parents? Is it really going to have an effect overall? And so to answer that question, I used what's called a Ricker competition model. If models make you anxious, you can just not look at this part. It's not that important. I'll just tell you this is a model that we can use to understand the growth of a population over time and the effect of competing between species on the population, on the size of the population. And what's cool about the Ricker model is we can calculate all of these. We can basically use our measurements from our experiment to solve for these sort of basic understanding things about the species. So what is the growth rate of the species? What is the carrying capacity? And once we use our experimental data to solve for those like main characteristics of a species, we can build these growth curves. And the big takeaway from these growth curves, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through them. But the big takeaway from these growth curves is that when we compete Ammophila breviligulata against Ammophila arenaria, there's unstable coexistence. This just means there's a tie. There are some situations in which Ammophila arenaria will outcompete Ammophila breviligulata, and some situations where the opposite thing happens. We see the same thing when we compare the hybrid to Ammophila arenaria. It's a tie. Sometimes one wins, sometimes the other wins. But when we do this model and we compare the hybrid to Ammophila breviligulata, the hybrid always wins. No matter how we start the population, the hybrid is always going to outcompete Ammophila breviligulata. So there's two ties and then one situation in which the hybrid is always winning. So the hybrid often can outcompete Ammophila arenaria and always outcompetes Ammophila breviligulata. So those are our big ecological interactions. We went through these questions and found out that the hybrid is abundant. There's over 200 patches of it. It is fertile. It's produced a hybrid swarm of interbreeding individuals. And these individuals are growing taller and more densely than their parent species. And they can competitively exclude Ammophila breviligulata. So the consequences of these results, I think about them in sort of three classes. There's the consequences for the ecosystem, the dunes that we all care about, right? Because the hybrid grows taller and denser, it might build dunes that are taller, wider, and more stable, which could impact ecosystem services that we get from our coastal dunes. So a taller dune might provide increased coastal protection, increased garbage storage, but because the grasses grow so densely, it might reduce biodiversity on the coast. There are also the genetic consequences of this hybrid, right? So I told you that the hybrid can backcross with one of the parent species, which might lead to gene flow between the two parent species. And we have this hybrid swarm, which is hybrids of all classes that are likely to continue to be produced and spread along the coast. And finally, there is this pretty extreme consequence of the competition with Ammophila breviligulata. So Ammophila breviligulata is the dominant beach grass in northern Oregon and southern Washington. So if the hybrid can outcompete the grass that's already the plant that's on the coast, that means that it could take over that territory and sort of change the balance of its interactions with its other parent species, Ammophila arenaria. So we are suggesting the possibility that it can spread along the coast in Oregon and Washington. And when we add all of that together, here are our big summary, which is just there is a hybrid beach grass in Oregon and Washington. It is able to sexually reproduce. We're predicting its spread with implications for our ecosystem services. And future research needs to continue to monitor it, including engaging more people to search for it on the coast. So with that, I'll close. I want to thank the wonderful organizations that gave funding to this project, including Sea Grant and the National Science Foundation, the Hatfield Marine Science Center. And as I said at the beginning, this really is a team sport. So many people helped with the setup of this project, including field work, collaborators all over the country, and setup and demolition of the experiment.